everyone. This is Marta Wójcik. I'm with the Springfield 2051 Steering Committee, and I see Kevin on the screen as well. Hi, Kevin.
I'm Marta.
And David Bureau, who's our future IQ wizard. So as you may know, this is the 2051 comes from the fact that 2051 marks Springfield 250th birthday. And this is a plan, this is a roadmap we are working on that will strategically position Springfield and lead our community toward a desired future. Now, what is that desired future? That is what we're trying to find out through community feedback, right? So through all this multi-month process, we are trying to identify what is dear to you, what you want to see to change in our community, what are your priorities, and that is shaping that roadmap. So I want to acknowledge our steering committee, which is a fantastic group of people bringing different points of views and different experiences within our community. In addition to steering committee that literally steers this project, is also our advisory group, and it's an extensive group of community members that come together on regular basis to advise on the project and to also help us network within the community. So I want to express our sincere gratitude to all of you for connecting us, for creating opportunities for listening groups and visioning sessions, and for all your input so far. Thank you, thank you. This is the beauty of this project, truly, to have to rely on this group of people who provide an ongoing guidance. With that, anything else, Kevin? Anything to add before we go on with David's presentation?
Two quick things that we should point out. It is now 2026, so this is the Springfield's 225th birthday, which is really exciting. This community has a rich history and has been around for a long time. And when you think of that, the next 25 years seems like a drop in the bucket compared to all the history of the past. So it's going to be here before we know it. And of course, the work that we're working on doesn't start in 25 years. It starts today. It started yesterday, and we're going to continue to build the community we all want to live in. The next thing, though, is just to point out clearly that the questions we'll ask David are the Q&A. So if you see on your Zoom, everyone has a different Zoom, whether you're on a phone or other things. But the Q&A, there's also a chat. You're welcome to chat with people. Please keep it cordial with other people that are here. People can put things in the chat. Can they interact on the chat? I guess I don't understand that well enough. But the Q&A will directly come to us, and we can then ask David those questions.
Yes, and absolutely. I hope you can interact. Zoom changes things on us all the time.
Yes,
so who knows? Let's give it a try.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll hand it to you.
Okay, thank you, Marta. And good evening or good afternoon, everybody. My task here is to try and thread some needles here in terms of what we've been learning from the community insights from the listening sessions, the think tank, and the community survey. So well over 2,000 people have weighed in on this collectively. And what I'm going to present is the sort of summaries of each of these things. So I'm going to start with the listening session, then we'll go to think tank, and then we'll go to the community survey. I'm going to present some data points and some threads that I've been pulling from those, like insights, I call them. Then we'll take a pause between each one of those for any sort of questions of clarification, which Marta and Kevin will direct. And that'll give us a chance to break it up a little bit. But I've got about 10 minutes, I guess, of insight sort of storytelling on each one of these, and then a little bit of an opportunity for some discussion. What I am pulling from is mostly on the project portal, but we haven't really pulled it all together into this sort of a narrative before. Why this is important to have a bit of an update at this point is that we're at a really important pivot point in the project. So really from July to December last year was a lot of community engagement, really trying to drill in on this notion of a shared community vision, what that would start to look like. That's coming into focus. Our focus for the first half of this year is primarily going to be working on this future roadmap. We did have a community summit obviously planned in late January, but that's been now sort of bumped a couple of times. We are obviously rescheduled for March, but this briefing today gives you a bit of a catch up on what we learnt at the end of last year primarily. So just some engagement metrics. We had 150 plus at the kickoff, had over 100 people attend the think tank. We have 700 plus people came to listening sessions, which ran through from early August through to late November. And our community survey, we ended up with over 1,500 people who responded to that survey. So in total, a really great data set. I mean, there is a little bit of duplication. Some people did all three of those things or all four of those things. But I do think we're pretty close to 2,000 very unique data points. I'm going to start with the community listening sessions. These sort of big chunks that I'm going to talk about did overlap each other, but the community listening sessions were the first step. And I have to say too, I just want to acknowledge Marta and Kevin and the steering committee for really pushing on community engagement. And so the listening sessions were designed to give as many groups as we could a chance to weigh in on the discussion. And just as an example, I think our first listening session was the 11th of August. We had it in a neighbourhood association. We also had some, we went to the Seniors Services Centre. I'm just going to show you a couple of these slides, but there was, 25 plus listening sessions where we did a session with the Fathering Strong and Promised Neighbourhood, Wittenberg University, and the BATs, so the students at the high school, and so on, right? So we had all these different groups. We went to McGregor Medal, we went to different schools, we went to different neighbourhoods, as much as we possibly could, right? And as I said, we had, sort of close to 700 people participate. We have produced a summary report, which is now on the project website, which is basically the verbatim raw data, but broken into all those different sessions. People weighed in with sticky notes on boards and things as we did those sessions. It's a really great resource. What I've done is a little bit of a high-level synthesis, right? Just knowing that a lot of us aren't going to get a chance to read through the whole report. But just as this is, and I should say too, preface this by saying some of this is my kind of insights, right? So, you can look at their raw data and you can draw your own conclusions. But if I was to talk about what I perceived as, call it the community condition, right? Think of the mood or the vibe or the pulse of the community. I framed this as saying, my experience was I found the community and the people who participated in the listening sessions to be predominantly proud, invested, and candid. So people gave us their honest thoughts. People who participated clearly cared a lot about the community, and there was a lot of pride about Springfield and what it could be. The pride ties to the identity, the downtown, and the resilience. So the historic identity, the sort of history of sort of entrepreneurship and invention that's occurred here, the downtown. You'll hear that come up a lot as I talk about things through this session. But people openly discussed issues around divisions in the community, challenges like housing and safety. Young people particularly talked about that issue. There was, in my observation, there was a very high emotional investment in the city's trajectory. So a lot of people do care very deeply about Springfield and where it's going or where it ends up. But the community also expects visible progress and follow through as we go. So they were the sort of high level sort of themes, but a couple of the kind of topic areas that I think are worth hitting on that really surfaced in the listening sessions. Economic growth is truly an anchor for a lot of people. People see that as just absolutely fundamental to being able to achieve the future you want. People really are interested in jobs and sort of the rate of pay. People want more of that. Workforce development, trades alignment was emphasised, that people see a lot of potential there, particularly as it ties to young people. The downtown revitalisation is seen by people as a real symbol of progress. A lot of people had talked about that they'd seen the downtown go through quite a deep slump, and are really excited to see things like new businesses there and restaurants, and seeing some of the current sort of refurbishment and housing developments occurring in the downtown. A real plus for people. And then this regional positioning, this notion of sitting between Dayton and Columbus in this really high growth corridor, was viewed as a key asset by a lot of people. So some really good stuff there in the economic growth as an anchor theme. Another big topic that really percolated through the listening sessions was youth retention, and it is seen as very much a strategic inflection point. What I mean by that is the way people see it. If you can tap into the youth and get them excited about the future, that makes a big difference to the community. If you don't achieve that, then you lose a lot of talent. So it's that sort of fork in the road strategic inflection point. Obviously, there's ongoing concern about keeping talented young people local. This desire for education to career pathways was sort of strongly expressed in the listening sessions. Youth engagement and really connecting with youth as part of the community people saw as really important. The bigger challenge is that youth retention is tied directly to housing, jobs quality, and the sense of belonging. But things that are, while challenging, are within the realm of your own decision making and influence. Housing came up a lot. It's seen very much as a structural issue. It's not just about affordability, but there's a lot of issues around housing stock, mismatch between what people are looking for and what's available, supply shortages in different locations and different types. Also concerned about gentrification and unequal investment. Again, that'll be a theme you'll hear through the community feedback as I go through it. This notion that not all neighbourhoods are equal in Springfield or have not been equal, but there's concern about where does investment occur in the future. A desire for this sense of a really balanced development across the neighbourhoods, like that it just doesn't all go to one area, but that there is a sort of a deliberate focus on investing in each of the neighbourhoods. But the housing stability, absolutely foundational to the future growth and cohesion. The other part, and this is part of where people were quite candid, that recognising that divisions do exist in the community, but by and large, people frame their comments very much about thinking about it being a solvable challenge. And I'll show you some more data on this that comes from the survey. But political, racial and socioeconomic divides were acknowledged. Issue of immigrant integration and belonging were discussed, and people feel a lot of pain points on that. A desire for this unity through collaboration and transparency. And again, this notion of leadership, execution, and accountability are key concerns in being able to address divisions and put in place key solvable actions. So from the listening sessions, this is what I kind of gleaned as the strategic imperatives, if you think of it like that. So if you sort of, what I gave you as a summary of what we heard, well, what does that mean, right? As we think about this pivot from asking people about the vision for the future and starting to think now about the roadmap, what can we draw from that work? I think linking economic growth to visible neighbourhood benefit is going to be a very important message for people, that they see economic growth delivering benefit at a neighbourhood level. Prioritising youth retention and workforce alignment. I think there's a lot of support for that, and I think it is an inflection point. So getting that right is going to be really important. The need to address housing supply and equity decisively. So, in other words, put some effort into it and make sure people know we're working on that. Building trust through transparency and execution, and shaping a positive and forward-looking city narrative. I think were the big imperatives that came from the listening session. You may frame these in different sort of language, so these are my words very much, right? But this is what we drew, or what I drew as the themes from the listening sessions. I want to turn to the think tank for a bit. So this was a really important, quite early in the piece, deep dive into the notion of what future do people want. We have also been validating the results from the think tank with a whole series of visioning sessions that we did. So there was probably, I think there's nearly 250, 300 people have weighed in on this, and less than 100 of those were at the think tank. So we've been able to get some good validation of the thinking out of the think tank. So the think tank was in September, late September, 2 parts, 2 Fridays. First part, we explored future trends, key drivers shaping the future of Springfield, looking at their future impact. The second part, we built these scenarios of the future, different versions of the future about Springfield, and started to explore what people saw as the expected and the preferred future. And I really want to show you that data from about the expected and the preferred future, because that gets, I think, close to this notion of what's the vision, as Marta talked about. Many of you have probably seen this, but just to recap, there is a think tank report on the project portal, so you can go and read this in full. But the framework of the think tank was built around these two big future splitting themes. How's the community going to evolve, the community evolution, and what's our focus for development? And these were built up from the work identifying drivers and their future impact. The community evolution, we're sort of asking these two ends of this big continuum. So what if we just rely on our existing established strengths? We're focusing on local needs, services driven by the current family needs and established patterns and so on, right? What happens if we do that? The other end was, what if we really step on the gas in terms of the community evolution and we think about creating this laboratory of learning, really being at the forefront of innovative approaches and adaptation, and we think about our education system being redesigned, and really fostering a culture of being open to new ideas and cultures and experiences, and thinking of diversity as the superpower. These ends of the continuum aren't intended to be good or bad, right or wrong. They're just different possible ways that the community could evolve, and what would be the implications if we went that way or we went that way. The vertical axis was around development trajectory. The bottom here, it's somewhat more, we just get absorbed by the regional growth. We know there's that growth occurring on the east side, particularly leaning into the Columbus ecosystem. But in this, you'd see, really using tried and tested models. We'd rely on that growth, that sort of natural growth happening to the east. Obviously, then be very car oriented. The top end, something different, which was really about, well, what if we take on building a unique strategic position? People talked a lot about, Springfield isn't big enough to have its own unique kind of brand and heft, right? So, well, what if we went down that path? Where we're really thinking about what's this unique strategic position that Springfield has in that larger kind of ecosystem, and really carving that out. That created these four big scenario spaces. Each one is a combination of the endpoints of the axes. We mapped those out and sort of built these different versions of the future. I'm not going to go into those in detail. They're in the think tank report. You can read how the groups predicted the future would occur under those different conditions. But the key part of this was using this framework here, this large matrix, as a way to think about a couple of things: the least desired, the expected, and the preferred future. And what we did was we pushed the scenarios to the background, put this 10 by 10 grid over the top of it. And because these axes are continuums, you can have various degrees of emphasis as you move along either of these axes. So it gives us this notion of having 100 different possible versions of the future that are all slightly different. What we then did was we had the think tank, but we've done all these sessions here where we were working to validate these scenarios, right? So we had different student groups, different neighborhood areas, different towns in the county, high school, Ridgewood High School, for example, and so on. And the think tank participants as well. So, and this data here, you can search this as well, right? But the red is the responses to where people saw as the least desired future. The green is where they saw the expected future. So what do they think will happen if we keep doing the same thing as we are? And the blue was the preferred future. So what's the most desirable, the optimum future? And these are stacked up by numbers of people. So the more people that picked a certain spot, the bigger that bubble grows. Really fascinating data, if you like data, right? So you can see this very clear pattern of perspective across a whole range of different groups. And as I said, there's 250, 300 people in this data set, for everywhere from school students to retirees and so on. If you pull out each one, and you can filter this, you can look at the dotted line here actually is the median point. You can also do the average point. You can select the type of future, and you can even select which participants do you want to look at in terms of which groups in the data set. But you can see there's a pretty tight correlation of data here. This is the least desired, so it's way down here in this slow and steady. We're sort of a very sort of status quo future. People didn't want that. The expected future, the median actually lands right here. So you can see the lot of sort of people clustering in this area. So we're a little down towards the being absorbed by regional growth, and sort of somewhere between this relying on the established strengths and this creating this laboratory learning. And then the preferred future is up here in the upper right scenario, and the median point is right here at this sort of 8-8 junction. But a lot of responses up here. Now, there are obviously a spread, and this was everybody had their say, right? So there are different views in the community. Obviously, what we're looking for as we think about a shared vision is that large point of consensus. And obviously here, within sort of 9 of these, sort of less than 10% of the choices available, the vast majority of people landed. And you can go and look at the think tank report and dig into more on that. Couple of things I want to add on this, right? So this preferred future that's sort of in that upper right, set for the future, was what they called it, the group that developed that. So if I talk about strategic significance, alignment and implications of that being the preferred future. So it's in the upper right quadrant, which is a combination of high development trajectory and strong community evolution. In this future, the community is simultaneously advancing economic performance and strengthening community evolution. So you've got 2 big things going on at once. There's a very deliberate approach on reducing inequality structurally, like so dealing with structural inequality and actually really taking that on head on. Enhancing the reputation. There's a lot of narrative in that future about rebuilding the narrative and the strategic positioning for Springfield, but also focusing on long-term resilience. I think a couple of things, what it represents is in terms of what I saw in the data in terms of this as being the preferred future. It's a very clear and intentional pivot away from stagnation towards, and a very deliberate pivot towards proactive transformation. This, to me, highlights a lot of appetite for change. Like, people are willing to throw everything in, take a risk, and think about this transformation. And transformation by its nature is dramatic, or it can be. In this future, education, innovation, and diversity are positioned as economic engines. So very important to think of education, innovation, not surprisingly, but the diversity is, people see as an economic engine and an advantage for the community. Examples of what people saw as the potential was, Springfield becoming this regional hub for data, energy, mobility, logistics, but also the unmanned aerial vehicles and so on, and entrepreneurship. Big focus in this one too on a balanced growth model. This was something that we actually talked a lot about in some of the listening sessions, this kind of concern about urban sort of sprawl. And there's this desire to preserve agricultural land and natural resources while growing opportunities. So I think that's a bigger conversation the community is going to have as we go through developing the roadmap. What does that actually mean? So how do you think about sort of preserving land and having growth boundaries and things like that? But there's a big narrative shift here from a sort of a Rust Belt recovery to a forward-looking innovation city. So some big pieces of what that future represents. My take on this in terms of what's the strategic significance of this preferred future. So what does that mean, like in a big picture sense as we plan? Talent retention, attraction become the core competitive strategy. So there's an attraction component here about people who may be working in that Columbus or the Dayton sort of ecosystems, but you're attracting them as part of your residency, part of your population, but also attracting sort of talent that would sort of support some of those business areas that people see as potential. And the talent retention is really important, that there's a lot of people perceive a lot of leakage of good talent. And how do you sort of build that talent retention and attraction as part of the core strategy? There's a view that natural resources could be leveraged as a long-term economic advantage. There was a lot of discussion about the water resources, for example, and about how the sort of ambience and the environment around Springfield can be part of that, appealing to people perhaps who are like climate refugees or people who are coming from areas that might be getting hotter and less comfortable to live. That a place like Springfield might be a really great sort of mid-size city that's got a lot of amenities but has a lot of these natural resources that translate into quality of life through trails and so on. I think a big part of this preferred future is that it really is looking and sort of forecasting an inclusive growth model that lifts disenfranchised families and strengthens safety as part of the perception of the community. Diversity becomes the superpower, and it's coupled with equity investment, so investment in creating great, more equitable circumstances for people. Family-focused investments. I think people see that Springfield is at its backbone is a strong family community, but thinking about K-12 excellence, childcare, housing incentives, and then this sort of the transformational portion is that Springfield being positioned as this regional innovation node, not a commuter dependency. And I think that's the desire that people have, but you could see in that expected future that there are a lot of people who do think that Springfield's natural trajectory at this moment is to be a commuter dependent community, but there is appetite, much more appetite to think about the regional innovation node piece. So that's the think tank data, and what I drew is the sort of significance out of that. I will pause there and again check if there's any questions, if there's anything showing up in the chat. Kevin or Marta, is there anything there?
David, so there's a question from Fred about, as you apply this matrix working with other communities, do you see different responses than you got in Springfield?
Well, this matrix, thank you. This matrix is actually Springfield's, right? So it's not, the drivers that made up these axes, the way people scored those, the driver, the identification of the drivers, the scoring of the drivers was all data from think tank participants. The scenario descriptions were developed by the think tank participants. I think what's pretty exciting about this from a data point of view is that we have a pretty tight concentration of people around this preferred future. You always have a bit of a spread, right? Sometimes communities will have two different nodes. There might be two different polarized sort of components in the community. That's not the case here. There's actually quite strong alignment. I actually haven't totaled that up, but there's probably 75% of people in that sort of 10% sort of area around that sort of preferred future sort of cross-section there on the median. And there is even a bubble of people who are even more ambitious, who have greater appetite for change. So no, this is Springfield data, and I think I was a little surprised about how much appetite there was, and and that's been well validated, like I said, from all these different groups, right?
David, if I can add,
Yes,
when
please.
we were looking at selecting Future IQ, right, we were looking at different firms, the steering committee, or the people that eventually would become the steering committee. One of the great things about Future IQ is they put all of these reports online for previous projects. So one of the actual neat things that I've found as being involved in the project is to go back to some of their other work for other communities and look at those reports, similar to reports to what we have. And while this is a unique study for Springfield, the system is something David uses, right? Where they plat these futures out. and you can see how other communities have responded. So to go and look on their website and look at reports from communities that are somewhat similar to ours, or places that are just interesting or you might know, you can kind of see, again, it's different data that's making up that report, but you can kind of compare it back and forth. And I found that really interesting. We've been doing that more recently, again, looking back at those reports. So check that out at Future IQ's website.
And actually in the think tank report too, we have each of the drivers listed out that people identified too. And I think that gives you a really kind of much more of a tactile sense as well.
Yeah. So I guess to Fred's point, David,
yes.
The communities vary in terms of like appetite for change, right? You see that kind of fluctuate in that sense.
Oh yeah. I mean, and some more aggressively so, and some much less so, right? I think here, because we are looking at Fairway out in the future, and the change that was being telegraphed in those axes was pretty dramatic. I mean, if you think about the sort of even the development trajectory, I mean, you're going from basically sort of somewhat sitting on your hands and being driven and absorbed by this regional growth between Dayton and Columbus, to the other end where you're saying, no, we're going to carve out our own niche and develop our own brand, and we're going to invest in innovation. I mean, really quite sort of dramatic shifts, right? And so being able to plot out that level of appetite for change, I think, is really important, because that helps frame and keep our feet on the ground when we frame the actions in the roadmap. All right, so the last piece I want to go through is the community survey, right? So the survey data is posted. It is closed now. It ran from September. We actually technically called the survey closed in December, but we did have our last response in the survey was in January. We ended up, as I said, with over 1,500 people taking the survey. It's a long survey, had a lot of qualitative and quantitative options, so numeric and open-ended. And I think this high participation rate indicates a strong interest in the city's future, at least from the people who took the survey. I mean, that's a really great survey response level. So I want to dive into this, a little bit of a synthesis of the survey findings. Again, a bit of a sort of, what do the overall data say? Well, if you think about it from a community condition point of view, like I talked earlier about the community being candid and so on, my read on the data here is the community is concerned but not cynical. I mean, I did not see many responses that you would just say, somebody is just really cynical or really just, very, very negative, right? I thought the responses were very thoughtful. Obviously some people are kind of pretty distressed about certain issues, but they were willing to sort of lay out what the issues were for them and talk about them in a way that was, I would say, is more concerned than cynical. So I wanted to just kind of give that flavour to it. I mean, people were personally quite positive about living in Springfield. I'll show you that data. We did identify a number of structural concerns that sort of dominate people's concerns. Again, they track very close to what we heard in the listening sessions. So the economy, the performance of the economy, housing issues and divisions in the community. I'll talk more about that. And the unity division scenario or story was the most consistent cross-generational tension. So it's a tension point, and it's really across a lot of generations. It shows up a little bit differently, but that was something that sort of really flagged in the survey. And I'd say that this is my kind of narrative here, but it's not a broken community. I mean, this is what you might call a credibility-seeking community. I mean, there are a lot of people who are saying, have a lot of pride in the community and its history, but are seeking a new story, right? And a new narrative and a new sort of strength in the community going forward. So I wanted to just kind of give you my high level thoughts on that. I have more data in this, right? So I'm just going to kind of whip into it, right? Some of the structural pressure points that people identified from across the survey. So this is an analysis done across the whole survey. Economic competitiveness and job creation are central to future confidence. People do feel that Springfield's underperforming relative to the region, but that there is potential. Housing affordability, multi-generational concern really jumped out in this survey. I mean, it's obviously on a lot of people's minds in this country, but here it was really a concern. The political and racial polarization are the primary perceived fault lines, if you call them that. So if you think of a fault line being kind of like where there's two sides of a fault line, right? There's a perception that the political and racial polarization, is creating that sort of crack in the community, and I'll talk more about that. Trust, transparency, and visible delivery of actions and results will determine the civic confidence. So I think people are feeling back to it's not a broken community. People are looking for things for the future, but there is a trust, transparency, and doing something to show progress is going to be important for people. I think that's part of why the downtown for people is such a sort of a magnet for pride, because they can actually see something happening. They can look at a building that's getting renovated or repurposed, or they can see, new businesses coming in, or a new kind of event occurring, and so on. So some of you have seen some preliminary data on this, but this was where we landed in terms of this. This is plotting. I love this chart, right? Because it's plotting 3 different questions. So it gives you this really interesting insight into community sentiment. So the horizontal axis here was plotting responses to the question about how do you feel about living and working in Springfield? Are you very happy? Or are you very unhappy on the left, or are you very happy on the right? So a -5 to +5, sort of neutral in the middle. The vertical axis was the community direction. So how do you feel about the current community direction? Very concerned, -5 at the bottom, to very excited, +5 at the top. And then the color is the community dynamics. So how would you describe the community? Is it -5, deep red being very divided, or bright blue being very unified? And what we did was we plotted the XY responses, and then we averaged that cohort of people. There's obviously, tens, if not dozens, if not hundreds of people in some of these circles, right? So we averaged that cohort to give you the color perspective. What was interesting when we started the survey, the bubble in the very lower left, so people who don't like living and working here are very concerned about the direction and feel the community is very divided. It was actually a pretty dominant bubble. There was about perhaps 20% of responses in there. But over time, as more and more people took the survey, we saw this upper right quadrant area increase in number, right? So more and more people sort of plotted into there, which is where people are feeling pretty good about living and working in Springfield. They're feeling pretty good about the community direction, even to the point of feeling quite excited, right? And so you have this cohort in this upper right, but actually a large chunk of people, and then people spread across it, right? And I'm going to dig into this a little bit more in some of the detail. You can look at the individual question plots on the project website. So each of those questions are there, as well as this one. You can also filter this by things like age group and where people live and so on. But I thought this is, other than a group of people here who are obviously kind of don't like living and working, feel very concerned about the future, feel the community is quite divided, it's a relatively small cohort compared to the dominant cohort, which is people who are feeling pretty good about the future. So I wouldn't call Springfield a polarized community. I'd actually say that you've got a spread, but you do have a significant bubble of people who are outliers, but feel most aggrieved about the current situation. So an example like this is one of those questions. So if you go to the chart here, the horizontal one, living and working, I just pulled this data out to show you. You can look at each one of these questions in this sort of format, and you can filter it by age group, ethnicity, how long people have lived and worked, and where do you live. And these are cumulative filters as well. So that data's there. So that was kind of encouraging, right? We also do a lot of analysis on the open-ended survey questions. And so we ask questions about what excites and concerns you about the community. The primary drivers of what was exciting people about the future, economic growth and development are leading lead people to see positive momentum. This economic development, particularly seeing investment in new housing on the east side, and some of the sort of downtown developments, that was very positive for people. They felt, that was driving some momentum. The job creation and industry expansion are central to optimism. If that happens, or as that happens, people are really excited about that. Obviously, if it doesn't, they remain disappointed by it. Downtown revitalisation signals visible progress. As I've said, that's just a recurrent theme, but that is a very clear beacon for people that somebody at least is doing some good stuff in the community. The amenities and recreation, enhancing the quality of life, that's a very high level there in terms of people's reaction to trails and some of the social amenities. Education infrastructure improvements, reinforce confidence. So they're the sort of things that people talked about that give them excitement about the future, or would it potentially. If you look at more numerically, so this was there was 1,100 open-ended responses. This just tracks the mentions, so the number of times the topic was mentioned. Downtown revitalisation, you can see way out here, economic growth and development, housing development, community pride and amenities, and then you sort of scale back. But obviously those sort of first big 3 or 4 there, you can see that reflected in the community listening sessions, and it comes through very strongly in this community survey as well. The primary drivers of concern, crime, public safety, big concern, particularly in certain cohorts in the community. Housing affordability issues, that obviously creates a lot of tension for people, a lot of distress. People feel they're being pushed out of some of the neighbourhoods. Economic uncertainty and job stability, obviously that sort of, or instability, I guess would probably be better said, create anxiety. Political divisions and trust in leadership impact the sense of cohesion in the community, so back to that fault line sort of narrative. And infrastructure decay reinforces negative perceptions. And of course, people talked a lot about the entrance corridors, or seeing houses that are being neglected, or properties that are sort of falling behind in their maintenance. These were the issues that drove the concern. If you look at it again in the sort of more numeric responses, again, number of mentions, 1124 people answered this question. Crime and safety, cost of living and taxes, housing affordability, lack of trust and leadership, political division, infrastructure decay were the ones that came to the top. The issue about the community division, that was one of the ones, like community dynamics we saw in that scatter plot before. Let's dig into that a little bit. So the primary drivers of where people see divisions or fault lines in the community, political polarisation is the most cited source of division. If you just look at people's words and what they use, racial and social equity concerns form a major structural fault line. There was a lot of discussion about, sort of parts of the community, Southside, for example, feeling like they miss out on a lot of what happens. Economic inequality reinforces this fragmentation. So, you have these very different kind of sort of patterns and neighbourhoods in the community, and people feel that, and in fact, these are not recent. I mean, I think a lot of these sort of fault lines or sort of points of division, they've been in the community for decades, if not generations, by some people's accounting. Crime, trust in leadership, and geographic divides amplify these tensions. So the tensions sit here, and then they get kind of more amplified when you think of, I see those people over there getting that and we don't, and so on. There are some generational differences, but they're not super dominant in this. Actually, there were some generational differences around some topics, but not so much in these drivers. If you look at the mentions, political polarisation, obviously way up here, race and social equity issues, economic inequality and income gaps, again, real sort of leaders in terms of the number of times there was responses. But then you cascade down into the sort of issues we just talked about. But this gives you another slice of the data. So what I like to do is look at it from macro theme and then back it up with number of mentions, so that we can cross-check to make sure that we don't have any bias in our interpretations. But then, of course, what unifies us, and this was, I thought, really interesting, Community pride and shared identity are the strongest unifying themes. I think people think and know that Springfield as a place has a big name, has had a big history, and that's very strong for people. Activities that bring families together, the schools, youth sports, and so on. At the events and festivals, creating a lot of cross-community connection. People love that, right? There was a lot of celebration of those things. The faith communities and volunteerism really helping build that social cohesion. And then this notion of coming together in challenging times. If you look at it in terms of the data, community pride and identity, obviously way up here in terms of number of mentions, local events and festivals, shared challenges, resilience, and so on. As we go down through that sort of curve. So again, a number of really strong themes coming through. What does all this mean, right? So this is really my last slide of sort of data or data interpretation. I look at the data from the community survey and think about, okay, what does this mean as the strategic opportunity for Springfield 2051 and this sort of the development of the roadmap? I think there's a yearning to figure out how to shift the narrative from division to shared economic mobility. That sort of a community that is investing and elevating people, but doing it in a way that is equitable and really, destroying the fault lines that have created division. I think it's going to be important to demonstrate early tangible wins to build credibility. I think there's an incredible amount of goodwill and people are leaning into the discussion, but there is that sort of caution of, well, will this be another one of these attempts, or will this be the effort that rallies people and we start to see progress forward? I think a key strategic opportunity is around engaging youth, around opportunities in the community and the retention pathways. Actually, in the data, there's a lot of senior optimism. So I think the 60 to 69-year-old, and 70 and over, were people who were happy and saw a lot of optimism for the future. And that civic pride is a real stabilizing force in the community. And I think there's a potential here to really build unity around this notion of a shared prosperity and visible progress. So they're the high-level strategic opportunities I saw in this. A couple of things just to add to sort of wrap up this part of it. As I said, we're here in the project timeline. We're sort of probably just a little bit more into here, but we're at this big pivot point between this sort of narrative about the shared community vision and starting to think about a roadmap. We've got a couple more things coming up that I want to just flag because this will be a chance to continue the discussion. So this webinar was really to dive into what we've been hearing from the community. The next one in a couple of weeks is going to be thinking about this strategic positioning. So I think there's a lot of evidence from the survey and the think tank and the listening sessions of people saying they want to see Springfield take its place in the world and really build this strong position and narrative. So we want to have this webinar to start to think about that and to share what we've been hearing. We will be at the summit, which I'll talk about in a minute, starting to reveal the draft strategic pillars that are sort of the building blocks of the roadmap that go around this notion of this sort of set for the future or leveraging our strategic position. And we do have the summit, that's going to be a chance to kind of build on the work that's gone in this last phase. Start to think about what are those strategic building blocks as we go forward, and start to have a big discussion and weigh in on ideas about that, right? So I want to finish that there. And Marta, I will just put this up, but I can go back. Obviously, you can track most of the high-level stuff I've talked about is on the project website. You can also dig right into that and go much deeper than I did in terms of the data. So it's springfield2051.com. So Marta, I'll stop my analysis there and see if there's any questions or so on from you in the comments.
Thank you so much, David. We shared the community listening sessions report link. And of course, you guys go to the website and see it, but it's a lot of data, a lot of notes, and it's really wonderful to see you take a look at it and synthesize it for us. So there are a couple more questions from David. He asked in the context of you were mentioning at some point housing growth to the east.
Yes.
And he's asking if there is a data that exists from businesses and industry of what the housing effects will be on the businesses on 40 from downtown east to I-70. And I have a sense that we could answer that question maybe at the next session, because it's going to be about that economic impact of those decisions. But I don't know if you.
Can I add to that too, Matt? I do think that's a really important discussion. We're going to have to dig further into that as we go through roadmap development. And why I think it's so important is that, the gravitational effect of Columbus is that housing developments that occur on the east side are primarily people who are commuting to the Columbus metropolis, right, for work. What we've talked about in some of these listening sessions and other sessions is the unintended consequence of that is it could start to drag the gravitational center of Springfield to the east, right? So if you've got a growing population out there, that more services and amenities and schools, etc., might go in that direction. And that could actually kind of pull activity out of the core of Springfield. And I do think there is an important discussion to have about, as an important community, how do you reinforce that center of your community, that sort of where people go to, and that traditional sort of historic and perhaps new area of activity. But again, that's going to be something I'm sure when we think about the strategic positioning, because that's right on point for that topic, right? So.
Thank you so much, David. And there's kind of another question from David that actually segues to what another question from Fred is, which is, David asked if, per Kevin's comment, to explore some other studies you did for other communities. He asked if there are some that are old enough to be able to see results those communities have seen, or at least tangibly planned. And it kind of, to continue, Fred asked, commented, political and business leadership will be essential to moving this process forward to implementation. How best to get their buy-in? And it feels like those two questions belong together in a sense.
Yeah, I think, there's two things on that. Yes, and we've also, and we'll touch more of this on the next webinar, but we've done a situational analysis which does a side-by-side comparison with a series of peer communities. So I think the way you could look at that is to try and understand what you can accomplish over time. You have to think about, okay, there's certain expectations of how long does it take to do things, right? And what resources do we have? But we are also, we've done a scan of previous planning efforts in Springfield, and what was the result from those? Because Springfield is a community that has risen to the moment to address the needs at a number of different points in relatively recent history, right? And even if we talk about, there's a lot of narrative about the downtown, right? You see that in the survey and the listening sessions and so on. That didn't just magically happen, right? I mean, people did work on that, and, groups that have made significant investments, and all that takes time. And so I do think there's as part of what we're looking at in that, I do think as we get into the roadmap, there'll be a way to go, okay, how fast can you move the needle on these things? And what have other communities been able to do to pull in to activate things? I think the fundamental issue, probably my final comment on this, is that I think the appetite that people are reflecting is to do things that are not the same old way we've done them, but to think creatively about new approaches, new partnerships, to be able to address some of these tough issues. I mean, there's not really an issue there that is an easy one, right? I mean, most of those, like housing affordability, structural inequalities, aging infrastructure, all that stuff, they're massively expensive and take a lot of concerted effort. But I think we can look internally in Springfield and look at what's happened that's been positive and produce progress there, and how did the community go about doing that? We can also look at some of these other benchmarking comparison communities to say, well, how did they go about causing transformation in their own environment, and what can we learn from that?
And to that point, David, you are working through compiling set of reports that include situational analysis,
That's
right?
right.
And also reports, kind of looking back at reports of various important studies that happened over the last 25 years in Springfield. So that will kind of really, I think, crystallize for us what is that strategic positioning also, and prioritize those subjects. So
absolutely.
Again, thank you all so much. Please join us on March 10th. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, you can also email us. The email for David is on the website, and you can also contact me. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.